Today, let's look at some electrostatic headphones, or ear speakers as they were called for a few decades. The Stax SR-Lambda Spirit. Wait. First, we're going to go off-road. I first want to say a very big thank you to one of my subscribers for my first bit of fan mail, a Panasonic HD10 driver. It's a broken one, but now it goes into my little wall collection, which I showed off a while ago. Anyway, back to the video. The SR-Lambda Spirit came out in 1992, pretty much 7 years after Stax released their final normal bias headphone. And these are, of course, Pro, which means that they run on a higher voltage than normal bias. The very last normal bias headphone that Stax released was the Gamma. I reviewed the Gamma Pro earlier in this channel. Let's start with the build. In general, all the SR-Lambdas, they're pretty much the same. They've got the flimsy headband, which is fully plastic. They're relatively light for their size. Honestly, I think the suspension headband gives a good weight distribution because of the amount of surface area it provides. I think all Stax Lambdas are actually also surprisingly comfortable. I don't really see what the fuss is about. I've seen a lot of people complain about the comfort and how it fits, but really, since there's almost no clamping force, most of the weight goes on the top of your head and it just sits there. Obviously, you can't do any headbanging because they will fall off, but yeah, never had a problem with it. Then moving further south, the cables are obviously quite wide because they are carrying a high voltage through it and they need to be separated out. And going back to the cups, yeah, they're a completely open design. You can see the driver on display there. The ear pads on the other side, they're okay, but they don't age particularly well, especially with a lot of use. They tend to get hard and start cracking, especially the more they're used when they respond to the acidity in human sweat. So, I'm not going to open these because these don't belong to me, but for comparison, I've got my Frankenstein SR-Lambda Pro with actually Lambda normal bias drivers, the 1979 drivers in here. So let's take a look at those. As you can see, my ear pads are not in as good condition. They are cracked. But honestly, the pads don't do an awful lot for the tuning regarding the bass seal because it doesn't provide a bass seal. There's cracks everywhere, or rather gaps, openings everywhere. It's not an ergonomic shape. So in all the Stax Lambdas, there's 4 screws, 1 in each corner. So you only have to lift up the pad to reach them. Actually, I should have taken the headband off first. That would have made my life a bit easier. To do that, you take off both at the same time, like this. You just pull them out and then lift it forward. If you try and do it one at a time, for some reason the pin gets stuck through pressure fit. After you've done it a few times, you realize the easiest way to do it is just to do both at once. Then there might be some old glue holding it together. No, not so much in this case. And there's the back of the driver. It's a little bit different, these, compared to the Spirits. These old normal bias drivers, they have a fine fabric mesh as a dust filter. And of course, damped with some mineral wool, or whatever it is. On the front side, you've got a very thin dust filter underneath the usual copper wire mesh. I know it's copper because I've seen them oxidize in other Lambda Pros and they turn green. So there's only one explanation for that, copper, or at least some kind of copper alloy. So yeah, looking at these, pretty much exactly the same thing on the front side. The dust filter itself is a little bit more iridescent, not completely unlike the HD10 driver I showed you at the beginning, but on the back, no damping, fully open, and again, instead of a fabric mesh dust filter, you have a very, very thin membrane, which is probably exactly the same as the front one, and it's a very similar material to the actual diaphragm itself. So even more open, this one. Let's quickly put this back together. And always go from the front. If you put the headband back from the back, this top part will get stuck here, and it'll do that instead of what it's supposed to do. So always pad side first. When putting it on, sometimes it works better to do one side at a time. It's much easier to put it on that way than it is to take it off, I found. One day I'll need to get that fixed. Maybe I'll find a cup or some spare parts somewhere. Anyway, enough of that. Well, no, not enough of that. As you can see, I've also created my own headband for this. It's not too difficult considering how simple it is. Got a nice fabric underside and a leather top side. And yeah, so the Frankenstein continues. This actually has an SR-303 cable just to make things even crazier. So that's a 5-pin connection for a 6-pin normal bias driver. I have to be careful with that, but enough of that. Bring that back later when we're doing sound comparisons. So on the whole, Stax SR-Lambdas, I find, are almost unique in their huge presentation of scale. So it might sound ridiculous at first, but the scale of a headphone, in my opinion, I find, can often sound, or at least can often be guessed quite easily by the size and shape of the cups, the pads, the baffle, etc., the different parts of the sound part of the headphone. So, as you can see, these are very tall and very open. And they actually do sound, to me, very tall and very open. The sound has a lot of height and depth. I think the only headphone I've ever heard that sounded taller and opener was the Perron, which is an electrostatic headphone from Russia. So the modern Stax, which are, in my opinion, essentially the new generation of the Lambdas, the SR-L700, L500 Mark II, L300, they all have that same scale and presence, although I think it's fair to say they are tuned quite differently to some of the older SR-Lambda series headphones. I found that frequency response in all Lambdas I've heard has always been actually quite very similar, with the same problems repeating again and again. For example, most notably, the biggest changes are above 1000 Hertz. I find the greatest variance in the way the upper mid-range is tuned. And I think that is where most of the differences are between them and where your tastes come in deciding which one you prefer the most. Obviously, a lot of them also suffer from treble peaks, or at least what sounds like sharp and peaky treble, because it doesn't always measure that way, at least not on the mini DSP ears. And again, of course, that's not the most reliable measurement device out there. Looking at the graphs, I always measure electrostats in two different ways. Firstly, I just rest them on the ears to get the graph you can see where there is no bass seal, and it appears as though there's quite a large hump in the lower bass and then an absolute roll-off into the sub bass. And then I measure it in a second way where I put it onto the ears, and then I get some elastic and force a bass seal between the pads and the anatomic ears on the measuring rig. And what I find that gives, as you can see, a perfectly linear bass response, which is actually closer to the real representation of how these sound. If I, for example, listen to my own Stax Lambda and compare it directly with, let's say, my modified Hi-Fi Man HE500, I find that the overall tone is really, really similar, all the way down to the sub bass. That's why I disagree very strongly with those old graphs that have the bass bump and the roll-off. Personally, I've only been able to enjoy this headphone using my Fuzzy Audio SK01 as a preamp. So using the tone controls, treble has gone down a touch, mid-range has gone down quite a bit, because actually, for whatever reason, very luckily, fortunately, the mid-range tone control on the SK01 is perfectly centered at 1000 Hertz, which is exactly what you need to correct an SR-Lambda, any SR-Lambda. And then the treble and bass are adjusted to taste, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a bit less, depending on the music recording. I found that I've really enjoyed these headphones a lot. Not quite as much as I enjoy my non-bias version, as they're a little bit more scooped out in the 3 to 4 kilohertz range, which is exactly the kind of tone I prefer, as demonstrated by my preference for my HE500, my Altier Cal 1H, etc. But in the end, the biggest deciding factor I found was these old filters. So these actually came with my SR-Lambda originally, and I think they're just very basic dust filters. You can't buy these anymore, but I think they're exactly the right thing that takes away that bit of tizzy, sharp spiciness in the treble and turns them into well, not completely smooth, but a much smoother sounding, more normal headphone sounding kind of experience. So I'll be holding on to these and looking after these for a very long time. Unfortunately, the spirits did not come with them. As far as I know, they never did, but it's something to think about. Maybe all you need to do to get rid of that extra spice, which EQ can't rule out perfectly 100% because it feels more like a presentation thing than a tuning thing, maybe just add a bit of foam. It could be that you just need to get a simple set of foam pads. I think these are for biodynamic. Just cut them to the right shape. Well, it doesn't have to be these, could be anything. Cut them to the right shape, put them in, and it should be a very different sound experience. Finally, if I had to describe the sound with just a few words, it would be big, spacious, airy, agile, transient. The transient response, of course, from electrostatics is phenomenal, and these are no exception. If you're willing to take a little gamble on something a little bit older and ready to put in a little bit more investment into the upkeep or renovation of one of these headphones, you will be rewarded. Stax Lambdas remain one of the absolute peak audiophile experiences, and of course I would very, very strongly recommend getting something that can drive them properly. At the very least, an SRM1 Mark II. And if anyone cares or is concerned, I would not recommend these for gaming. The imaging, it's not particularly wide. So you do get a decent stereo image, you do get a good soundstage, but when it comes to positional cues, things are brought in a little bit closer. So things very quickly either sound more in front of you or behind you, but not necessarily to the side. So that's something to consider for the gamers. Although, if you're buying one of these for gaming, what are you doing? It doesn't, no, just no. And of course, if anyone's curious, I am running these out of a Stax SRM313 for this review. There you go. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.